What's up, everyone? Back for another episode of Locked On Bucks and continuing the conversation from Media Day yesterday. It's always a fascinating time. Media Days providing some pretty good content on the old socials, but we didn't really talk about Jordan Nwora's contract extension, so we're going to get to that. We've brought in our salary cap contract expert, Frank Madden. Let's get started.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Bucks. I'm your host, Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on this show daily and also find my work over at ESPN. And alongside me, the founder of brewhoop.com and longtime voice of the podcast, Frank Madden. Frank, you didn't introduce yourself like that in the feature length movie. Honestly, the only thing that was longer than that was the Irishman movie. When you sent me that audio clip, I could not believe what I was looking at. But go back and listen to Frank and JJ and Eric talk about movies and TV and a little bit of basketball mixed in there as well. But I didn't.
We at least started. We had the decency to start with basketball, just to get that out of the way. So
yeah, but you didn't.
And actually, we finished with some basketball too. I think we talked about Jordan Nwora at like the very end, which I challenged people who made it all the way to the end to tweet at me, and I think Dan Schaefer and one other person tweeted at me today. Who I need to find that person just so I can give them a special shout out on this podcast. But yeah, it was it was an off-season podcast.
No, there's no doubt about it. And you got it in just in time because now we are fully locked back into basketball. We thank everyone for making Locked On Bucks your first listen or first watch. I've enjoyed scrolling through Twitter and seeing the feedback from fans about different quotes, different players, all the different things. But that was a perfect segue talking about Jordan Nwora because that's where we're going to start today. So we wanted to get to it yesterday. There was too much to talk about. So we had the podcast last week before you guys spoke about it, Frank, and said, okay, well, decision time is looming. What are we going to expect? I must admit, I didn't really think that he was going to take the final roster spot as it appears that he has for now. 2 years, $6.2 million. What can you tell us?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing I said in the 95-minute mark of the podcast from Friday was, well, I mean, if the Bucks have this qualifying offer, I mean, he can just take the qualifying offer. I mean, he's not going to end up in the G League or something, or out of the league or something. Given he could have just taken the qualifying offer. So, I mean, clearly the Bucks at this point, you could only assume that they were fine with him coming back, and who knows what level of interest there may have been from other teams. Again, not like anybody was going to offer him big money, but if some team was willing to take a flyer on him, they probably figured like, well, I mean, if we're going to give him, $2 million a year or something, then the Bucks will probably just match it. So what's the point? And everybody moved on. So yeah, I don't know. Again, is there, did they need to pay him $3 million rather than $2 million, which was his qualifying offer amount? I don't know. We can debate that, but it's obviously not a huge amount of money. But ironically, the biggest takeaway I have from this decision is that once again, the Bucks and Bucks ownership have said, "Fuck it, let's run it back," and we don't care how much money we're sort of committing on the margins. Because even if you say it's only $3 million, right? Easy to use that aggregated in a trade, could be useful, come deadline, depending on whether or not Jordan Nwora is somebody that, distinguishes himself on the floor. But, and we should always offer the caveat when we're talking about, total kind of cash outlay, including taxes and payroll and all those things. The tax is not set until you get to the end of the season. So effectively, you have until the trade deadline to shed salary effectively. But look, if you add contracts, it's always easier to not do. If you're trying to maintain a lower sort of total cost structure, you're better off not adding salary than adding salary. So I think net, the multiplier, again, as we've talked about on this podcast, on the margin at this point, given where the Bucks are, how high above the tax threshold they are, there's about a $4 tax hit for every dollar of incremental salary. So basically, you're bumping your tax bill by call it around $12 million, in addition to the fact that you're adding $3 million in salary if Jordan Nwora is on the team throughout this coming season. So, I mean, again, I always kind of caution people a little bit because, it's not Jordan Nwora's fault that he's the last guy to join the roster. So to say that they're paying $15 million for Jordan Nwora, you can argue that's not entirely correct, sort of from a logical perspective. But again, they had 14 guys. They didn't have to add a 15th roster spot, as we've been talking about. They could have just kept the open spot, gone into camp, used it, depending on what happened with injuries, things like that, right? Try to find your Wesley Matthews of this season, guy that you add during the season. But they opted to bring Jordan Nwora back. And again, especially given just the questions that he obviously has on the court, I think the biggest standout from this is just what it says about the Bucks' willingness to invest in this roster. And now we'll see what Jordan Nwora can do on the basketball court, right? And I think with Khris Middleton, based on what we heard, over the summer, and certainly what we heard on media day, Khris out of the cast, but not at the point where he is doing on court, work or getting close to 5-on-5. So sounds like he probably won't be ready on opening night. And of course, Joe Ingles, the number one Kane Pittman fan on the Milwaukee Bucks, Joe Ingles out for the first few months of the season. So, we talked about MarJon Beauchamp having a great chance at early season minutes. Throw Jordan Nwora in there as well. He played a very sneaky 1,200 minutes and started 13 games last year, which I don't know that everybody really kind of processed just how much he played last year, and really just didn't score consistently enough to kind of make kind of follow through on some of the promise he had in those limited minutes as a rookie. But he gets at least one more chance here this camp and this fall to impress Mike Budenholzer. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you there's a high odds of him kind of falling through and really developing into maybe a guy that can give you regular season minutes. He did that even last year to a degree, but I think the real question is, is he a guy that could actually get postseason minutes? And we saw where Bud was on Jordan Nwora as a postseason contributor during the second round when he really needed wings, and he decided to just not play Jordan Nwora. So, is there a small chance that he breaks through? Yes. But again, I think the biggest thing I can say about this is I'm impressed the Bucks were willing to pay a pretty high price for the chance that Jordan Nwora may still turn out to be something, or at a minimum, may be able to be a contract that they could use in a trade come deadline time.
I would make a bet that there is going to be a Twitter conversation upcoming in the early weeks of the NBA season. I don't think you'll be able to find those odds, but you can find other odds, though, at betonline.net, which is your number one source for football betting this offseason. Also some basketball stuff. Frank, we were having a brief conversation about this. I think that there's something that's bothering you about the betting lines. Is that right? The potentially the championship lines. I mean, we've had people ask me, and this is something that I've been tweeted in a little bit. Can you and Frank talk about the Boston Celtics? Maybe we can get to that a little bit later in this podcast. But I had a look online, and it appears the Celtics are still favorites in the East, which seems a little interesting given what we've seen the last few days / perhaps week.
Yeah, and look, I've generally been a guy that has respected the Boston Celtics and been fairly high on the Celtics, even last offseason when people weren't that high on them. I was always kind of like, this team should be pretty good, and obviously we saw the second half of the season, the postseason run, et cetera. We can debate whether they should have made it out of the second round, if the Bucks are healthy, but hey, the Bucks weren't healthy, right? And the Celtics ultimately took care of business and made it all the way to the finals. And, a couple of things break differently. They could have won an NBA championship. And certainly the Brogdon move, I think, is one that you have to like on paper at least. But I mean, it's been I would say a month or 6 weeks ago, I'm not really mad about people saying that the Boston Celtics should be favorites in the East. I think, I probably would have said like, maybe I would give them a little bit of an edge in the East just based on their depth. And again, just maybe concerned the Bucks are letting things just get a little bit stale, a little bit old. But now I just kind of look at it and it's like, what's happened in the last month? It's like, okay, Gallinari out for the year, maybe not the end of the world, right? But now Robert Williams, a 4 to 6 week cleanup on his knee, is now an 8 to 12 week. injury on the knee that caused him to miss only 3 or 4 weeks, and he came back too early, and obviously wasn't the same player after that. So who knows what's going on with that, right? I mean, you hope that he's going to recover fully from that injury, but he's going to miss maybe the first couple months of the season, which obviously again doesn't necessarily mean that they can't win a championship, because I think they're probably still the odds-on favorites to at least have the most wins in the East. But now this Udoka thing, I mean, arguably the guy who did as good a job as anybody last year from a coaching perspective, and all of a sudden he's just gone. And I mean, I don't think we're going to try to legislate like what happened, didn't happen, all that stuff with this really kind of sensitive issue, behind closed doors issue, with breaking the obviously organizational policies, and again potentially exposing the Celtics to also some legal issues. But the bottom line is, like, I mean, what's he going to come back in a year? Just act like they're going to act like none of this happened? I mean, odds are, I would guess he's not going to coach another game in Boston. And they lost Will Hardy, their number one assistant, to the Jazz in the offseason. And now Joe Mazzulla, who the heck is Joe Mazzulla? I don't know. He's a third-year assistant. He's going to be leading this team that is, on paper, still the NBA Finals favorites. Like, I just can't believe that they haven't taken more of a hit so far in the betting markets, because between the Williams injury, and again, just sort of like this whole coaching situation being thrown into chaos, man, the Celtics have just some really weird vibes around the team right now. And already there were kind of those questions about, with Jaylen Brown, maybe Marcus Smart being thrown into some of the trade speculation with Kevin Durant. Again, I still view the Celtics as my number one sort of rival for the Bucks in the East. But I'm a little surprised that there hasn't been more movement from just a betting lines perspective, because it just seems like just a lot of bad vibes around the Celtics. And you can debate how important coaches are, but they had a very good coach, and now they have a real gap in terms of leadership on their bench. And I don't know, just a lot of uncertainty for a team to come into the season and be title favorites at this point. So I don't know. I mean, again, I hate the Celtics. I lived in Boston too long to like the Celtics, but I do respect them. But man, this is a lot to go through. I'm just really curious to see how they kind of manage through this. And obviously the microscope is going to be on them even more than it otherwise would have been.
Just a little bit of podcast craft required when it's a 60-second ad read, and you give us a 4-minute spiel on the
you
Boston
asked my
Celtics.
question. You asked me things. I don't know. BetOnline can get their money worth, right?
Look, they'll be happy with this little line we got here at the bottom of the screen here on YouTube. So shout out to BetOnline, fantastic sponsors of the podcast. Well, we don't need to come back to the Celtics later in the podcast. So this is great. So at least we've knocked that off the list. So it all works well. But go to BetOnline. It remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information. There's live betting, up to the minute scores for every sport out there as well. So head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. That's BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, so it's interesting.
By the way, one last note on the Celtics. I don't know if you saw Jaylen Brown's comments, where he was basically like, if you talk to Ime Udoka or whatever, and he was just like, we haven't really heard what's going on, and I haven't talked to him. No. Just so weird, right? I mean, such a weird situation. And of course, who knows, right? I mean, like, maybe they're talking and he just is saying that because he doesn't want anybody asking questions.
Yeah,
very possible, right? Or the Celtics may have just told him, like, look, guys, here's a blanket statement. Just act like you got no idea what's going on and leave it at that, right? I have to think the team has a more informed view of exactly what happened, certainly more than the public knows at this point. But obviously a serious situation, and regardless of the realities of what didn't happen behind closed doors with Ime Udoka and whoever he had this affair with, very real impact on the Boston Celtics. And again, this is just the kind of drama that I don't think any team really wants. And I don't know, just a reminder, right? I mean, we're seeing with the Suns too, like just some of these teams last year. I mean, the Suns had the best record in the regular season last year. The Celtics have this great run into the finals, and media day for both teams, just like really weird, like bad vibes for, just some very non-basketball or off-court type reasons. And I don't know. It's just obviously media day, who cares? But you have to just wonder kind of how these teams are going to react. And I mean, we see it, right? Like teams look unbeatable, great one year, and just stuff happens and human nature kicks in and weird things happen and then stuff changes.
Yeah, I did for a second at least consider the idea that Brattle Stevens might dust off the whiteboard and send himself back to the sideline rather than go in with essentially an untried assistant. But anyway, it'll be fascinating. And clearly, if you're a Bucks fan, you're following this closely from the on-court perspective to see how they start the season and whether it unravels a little bit, because it certainly hasn't been ideal. So when the Bucks drafted MarJon Beauchamp, I think we had the conversation that this felt like, as far as wings go, because of the point that you referenced, that Bud refused to put Jordan Nwora on the floor, even though he'd had significant exposure through the regular season. I think we discussed the idea that MarJon Beauchamp felt like a guy that was more Bud, the type of skill set, defense first, and then, we'll see what comes along, even though he shot the three ball pretty well at Summer League. So we expected that Beauchamp was going to get opportunities early in the season, but now Jordan Nwora is back. I am curious to see where the pecking order is in terms of who gets the first minutes here, because I would bet that the Bucks Twitter conversation early in the regular season will be surrounding Beauchamp and Jordan Nwora, particularly if it is Jordan Nwora that gets the first look with this team. Now, the investment is different. Jordan Nwora was a second-round pick. Beauchamp, the Bucks haven't had many first rounders recently. They certainly haven't exactly got a strong history with their first rounders. So you would love to see Beauchamp get an opportunity early, but now all of a sudden we kind of have this battle, and maybe they can both play, but we have this battle that I probably wasn't anticipating was going to happen last week.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to make a MarJon Beauchamp joke or some sort of pun like that when you were talking about.
I tell you what, the minutes could be marginal. That's all I'm going to say. But now they've been split 50-50, so we'll have to see how it plays out.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just thinking about bad puns like Jordan may win the battle, but MarJon will win the Nwora. I don't know, for minutes. I don't know. Yeah, it's gonna be really interesting, just especially with Middleton out there and obviously Ingles out. There's obviously a gap in terms of wing availability. I mean, Pat Connaughton and Wes Matthews. I think if the Bucks had to play a playoff series tomorrow, much like we saw in the spring, Pat Connaughton and Wes Matthews would be the two guys that you feel like you could count on. Those are definitely guys that are going to play real minutes. We also talked about the fact that Wes Matthews, given his age, probably not somebody that you want to play tons and tons of regular season minutes. They're going to want to mind his wear and tear and kind of manage that. And for that reason, I think we both were of the opinion that, we didn't think Wes was going to necessarily just come in and continue to start, even though he was the starter late in the regular season into the playoffs. And everybody, including Bud, agreed that probably, I think everybody was aligned to the fact that made sense and was the right call. Khris going out obviously necessitated a change, and we saw Grayson Allen eventually go back to the starting five. But yeah, I think both those guys have, MarJon and Jordan Nwora both have golden opportunities here to kind of win some minutes. I think the hardest part is in the preseason when the main guys are not really going to be playing much anymore anyway. What does Jordan Nwora's game, how does that translate? Well, we know it can translate to these garbage time preseason whatever type scenarios because he's a guy that can create his own shot. We've seen him, have, I guess I would say his record in summer league is not always been great. But we've seen at various points, especially in his rookie year when he had starts, he put up monster numbers. Even last year, 13 starts, 16.5 points a game, 42% 3-point shooting. And probably about like half of those games were kind of punt games. But he also started a number of games when they actually were playing their regular guys. And it was because of, again, people like Khris being out. So it wasn't like he was only starting games last year in these weird scenarios, but he also had a number of games where he was going like 40 some minutes. He had more 40-minute games by a mile than, Khris. I imagine Jordan Nwora had more 40+ minute games last year than Khris, Drew, and Giannis combined in the regular season, which is just obviously one of the weird quirks of how Bud, manages lineups. And again, Jordan's one of those guys when a bunch of people are out, he's just going to play a ton. So so I don't know. We'll see. I think at this point you expect Jordan Nwora in a preseason type of situation should be able to score points. MarJon Beauchamp, obviously we saw him in Vegas, pretty limited role. I think shot really well from 3-point range and didn't really show much else offensively. Kind of defensively, I think we saw hints at the tools that he has and the defensive ability that, as you've alluded to, would probably be the thing that is most going to stand out to Mike Budenholzer. So I'm fascinated to see how that kind of battle for minutes goes. I think both guys are going to get a chance to play early, and I think hopefully it brings out the best in both of them. But I think when push comes to shove, when you think about what's going to win minutes in a playoff situation, I mean, Bud's pretty much already sort of shown what he thinks of Jordan Nwora. And again, I think Jordan is better than what he put up last year in terms of his numbers. 51% true shooting, slightly under 35% 3-point shooting after shooting like 45%, I think, on the really small sample as a rookie. Again, subsisting on self-created step back jumpers is always going to be kind of a hard way to be an efficient scorer in the NBA. But I don't know. We'll see. And again, I think, especially on a team like the Bucks, which has, as you said, the cupboard has been very thin in terms of developing young players. And right now you look at this roster, in terms of young guys, it's Beauchamp, it's Jordan Nwora, it's Mamu. And what are the odds of any of those guys becoming like real good playoff type rotation guys? I'd say Beauchamp, we probably have the most optimism for, just because of his defensive toolkit. But with all these guys, there's obvious risk, and they're going to have to go prove it. And with Jordan, the clock is obviously ticking. And I think the way I would foresee this, having the second year, what sounds like a second year guaranteed with no options, makes him maybe a little less appealing, again, unless he has a bit of a breakout from a trade perspective. But I think if you're the Bucks, hopefully he plays well enough that you at least have some optionality come the trade deadline to use that $3 million salary potentially in a trade if you want an upgrade. Again, if Beauchamp plays really well, then you might look at Nwora, even if he has played solidly, and say, well, we just don't need a guy at that spot, and maybe you move him and package him with, again, George Hill's $4 million contract. You have obviously Grayson Allen at $8.5 million. He's another contract that could potentially be moved as well. So I think the reckoning, I think it's this fall is the audition for Jordan Nwora, and if he plays really well, then great. Might get traded anyway. And if he plays poorly, then he might get traded simply because, again, that contract number just could be used for aggregation in a bigger trade. So, obviously the Bucks, somebody inside the Bucks org, he has enough people that still see something in him in order to make this investment. But, not exactly, I would say that it's not exactly an indication that, Bud is suddenly now a believer either, because the last time we saw him, he seemed to be very much not a believer.
Yes, they will. And, I think it's interesting because if you project ahead to the postseason, everyone, as we do, talk about a postseason rotation. But realistically, it's 9 guys, 10 guys max. So probably Beauchamp and Nwora, well, clearly Nwora, are on the outside looking in regardless. But stuff happens later in the season. So the start of the season could be important for them too, to put themselves at the front of the pecking order. I know this was a topic of discussion we had in the group text, in the group message, Frank. I don't know whether there was a resolution to this. Is there any rules, regulations around what the second year might look like for this deal? We know that the Bucks, they like to give out player options like T-shirts at Fiserv Forum after the Bucks hit a 3. They like to just hand them out. They hand them out. Is there any rules? Did we get to the bottom of this?
Well, I think did Eric report that there were no options, or did he just tell us? I don't know. I don't know if we're breaking news 25.
Hopefully it's correct. I'll tell you what. Hopefully it's correct. You just put Eric's name to it. Jeez.
A source at the Athletic Wisconsin whispered to us that he understood there were no options. But anyway, so hey, if it was like non-guaranteed or something like that, that would be totally fine in the second year or something. But I don't know. I'm guessing it's just a fully guaranteed second year. So we'll see. But so playoff rotation, if we had to guess at our playoff rotation, I would say, whether Wes is actually starting in the playoffs or not, I don't know, right? At some point, Father Time will come for Wes Matthews, as much as I don't want to admit it. But, I'm just assuming Wes is going to be in there whether he's starting or not. So essentially your starting group, including Brooke Lopez plus Wes Matthews. And then as far as the bench goes, I have to think Bobby Portis is obviously in there. Pat Connaughton and Bobby are the two guys. You just made huge investments in those guys for the future. So again, even though probably neither of them starts, those are the two guys that I feel confident in saying that they're going to play some role. Joe Ingles, presumably, right? You didn't just use your one real piece of off-season flexibility in the taxpayer mid-level to bring in Joe Ingles and then not play the guy. So would have to assume Joe Ingles is part of that. And then, I mean, it gets kind of funny after that, right? Because I assume Grayson Allen, they will try to get Grayson Allen to be a key part of the kind of playoff rotation. But that now you're already at 9 guys, and we haven't talked about a true point guard, right?
One of the guards, right?
Yeah, because Grayson Allen's not. I mean, basically, we're saying like it's Drew Holiday and like a bunch of non-point guards essentially in the rotation. And I mean, again, Giannis and Khris can do a lot. Joe Ingles, part of the piece there is that you can run pick and rolls with them and things like that, or you could bring the ball up when needed. But I mean, whatever. It's not point Joe Ingles or something like that either. So yeah, it becomes really interesting because we just named 9 guys. We haven't mentioned a point guard. I know you and Justin talked about George Hill and Javon Carter. I mean, that's 10 guys, and like, I mean, the Bucks, Bud hasn't typically gone 10 deep. Normally, somebody gets injured, so you don't even really have the option of doing that, right? Like, it's really fanciful to talk about in September how like, oh, how are you going to play all these guys? And then, the playoffs come around and you're missing one of your star players, and
well, they didn't have so last year because they brought everyone back. So if we say those 10 guys, then last year you didn't have Khris Middleton, you didn't have Joe Ingles, right? So yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, yeah, you got some options there, but we know typically it's not a perfect world at the end of 82 games, but it's deep for sure, and that's why it's interesting with Serge. Go down the list. These guys, Beauchamp, that you invest a first round pick. It's almost like really, really hard to see how they would crack a rotation, regardless.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and look, I feel like I'll call myself a MarJon Beauchamp realist. I won't call myself a skeptic because I'm definitely.
No, I mean, you can call yourself a MarJon Beauchamp realist. Other people want to call you a rookie hater, but we all come up with our own terms for this. Continue.
But that said, again, one of the appeals of him is the bar for what he has to become, given his general skill set, is really not that high, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't have to be a great 3-point shooter. He doesn't have to become like the absolute like best possible version of himself defensively, because he should be pretty good defensively. Like his baseline is like probably pretty good defensively. His shooting, that's obviously a bigger question. You hope that what we saw in Vegas carries over. And if he just does those two things, it's like, honestly, like in the Bucks offense and the Bucks defense, I mean, what did Wes have to do offensively? Like just knock down the occasional 3 and maybe back cut like once every 2 games and get a layup or something like that. Like, it's not like Wes could like dribble or do much of anything off the bounce at this point either. So I think Beauchamp is probably the guy who has the best line of sight sort of out of those others to maybe break through. And again, like, this is not to say that I'm expecting to be a rotation guy in the playoffs, but again, just think about a potential matchup against a team like the Celtics, and you're having to defend, a lineup that has Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart, guys that we saw, including Marcus Smart. I mean, Marcus Smart also just like went through the Bucks smaller guards and had no problems just like out muscling them. I mean, he even did that to Drew a few times. So who's going to be able to kind of deal with those types of guys and have some flexibility? Again, Beauchamp, I'm not expecting him to play 40 minutes and be a lockdown guy, but at a minimum, he hopefully you just cross your fingers that he's a quick learner and that he can knock down some open threes, because Lord knows the Bucks seem to have problems with the latter issue. And the other thing too is one other comment just on Jordan Nwora. We talked about after his rookie year, he was much better as a pull-up three-point shooter than he was as a spot-up guy. And his rookie year numbers were such a small sample that it was hard to tell, how much of any of that was real. But it happened last year again too. I think he was 33% from three, like under 33% from three spotting up as a rookie, and then he was under 35% spotting up from three as a second-year guy. And this is a kind of one of those classic problems for college scorers is, okay, now you're playing fewer minutes, shorter stints, and you're not really on the ball as much. The offense isn't running through you. You're going to get 5 shots in your, 9 minutes. And do you make, 1 or 2 out of 5, or do you make 2 or 3 out of 5? And some guys just struggle with that, right? I mean, we always see that all these guys, there's no shortage of guys who are good offensive players in college who just can't, be the quote unquote microwave scorers in the pros. And our friend Dean Maniat was sort of raising this question that we were having some debate about in our DMs today about, this idea of the microwave scorer, which is something that, I'd say optimists might look at Jordan Nwora and say like, well, he, if he can just become that like guy off the bench who just can go off and get hot offensively, like that's really a valuable thing. And Dean was kind of saying like, do good teams really tend to have a lot of those guys? Like, is that something that like most good teams have? And we were kind of debating it. And, we talked about Jordan Poole and Tyler Harrow, who are, say, much higher volume versions of the microwave scorer type guys off the bench. But yeah, I mean, guys who, are like hot and cold shooters and marginal defenders. Yeah, those guys tend not to really be hallmark staples of playoff rotations. And at this point, that's what Jordan is. And so I think the question is, can his skill set develop the consistency offensively to, again, allow you to tolerate some of the limitations defensively? And look, he's not small. It's not like he's like a small guy, which to me defensively is always a starting point. It's like, if you're just like kind of big and you play with focus and effort, like you're not going to be like horrendous, right? If you're like 6'2" and 180 pounds, like life's going to be really hard, even if you try in a lot of cases defensively. So, I'll just say it again, like cross my fingers for Jordan Nwora. Good luck to him. Hope he kind of takes some of the learnings of those first 2 years and, takes a real step forward. But the good news for the Bucks is, they don't need Beauchamp, Nwora, and Mamu to like all hit and all become rotation guys. There's very little room for them in the next year or so anyway to do that. But hopefully at least one of those guys, really starts to show some progress, because especially Mamu, you're going to have to figure out what you do with him after his second year on a two-way. If they had kept an open roster spot, I would have said, who knows, maybe they look to convert Mamu late in the season or something like that. But Nwora, obviously clock is ticking, and Beauchamp's really the only guy that probably has a little bit of a leash at this point and some room and some time to develop. But even so, Bucks fans, we will not be patient, and you can only live with kind of the growing pains so much. But again, if you're Mike Budenholzer, you can live with some of the offensive growing pains if guys are contributing defensively, which obviously that's kind of the hope that maybe MarJon can carve out a role through that end of the floor.
You mentioned the playoff bar is in terms of skill set, isn't that high for MarJon Beauchamp. I would like to further that point by saying if he can top 30% from three in the postseason, he will go down as one of the greatest three-point shooters in Bucks playoff recent history. So I would like to agree with that. Hey, thanks for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. We'll continue to go through Media Day. We haven't really broken down exactly what Giannis spoke about from a bigger picture perspective. I thought Drew Holiday was interesting talking about the fact that he just moved on from the loss to the Boston Celtics. So we'll talk about Giannis, Drew, and Khris as well. We haven't really touched on those on the big three all that much so far. So now for your second listen, make Locked On Fantasy Basketball your second listen, because Josh Lloyd, fellow Aussie, he hosts the number one daily fantasy basketball show on the planet. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And I'm sure we've got plenty of listeners who are just starting to get fired up for the fantasy basketball season. Frank, I got to get the heck out of here. I got to get to the arena. Australia is still, Australia is still in the World Cup, and they're battling along. They're playing well. US, I don't think anyone's even watching the US because they're winning by 90 points every single game. So look, I guess we've both still got a team that's alive right now.
Go Opals. Go Opals.
That's right. That's exactly right. Exactly right. All right.
By the way, we can afford to just like gloss over our 3 star players because let's be honest, this team just there's not enough drama to really truly get worried about it, right? They say this nice things, some interesting things, but whatever. At the end of the day, they're not making headlines. The only headline was this Steph Curry thing, which to me was like a total like nothing burger from Giannis about best player in the world. Like, who cares? Giannis being Giannis. Oh, Matt at Otter MB. Matt is the other person that got to the end of our 90-minute podcast the other day. Shout out to Matt. And that's it. You can end the podcast, Kane. I'll shut up now. No more 90-minute podcasts this week.
You're a special type of person if you can get through a 90-minute podcast just to send in the feedback. And that's some podcast craft from Frank Madden. He knows how to find out who is listening to the end. So we throw a little question to the listeners at the very end. So that's why he's a veteran. That's why he's a veteran of the caper. All right. We'll be back tomorrow. Continue to talk about Media Day. Speak to you guys then.